between rich and poor, white and black, male and female, historically advantaged and disadvantaged. To be able to climb the social and economic ladder, have social mobility and realize economic emancipation, education in general, and higher education more especially provide a determining mechanism. Yet despite huge efforts, the stakes remain enormously, often unbearably high, for black students from socio-economically disadvantaged backgrounds to access, progress through, and succeed in South Africa's universities. They often come to university not only carrying their own hopes and aspirations for a prosperous future, but also bearing the expectation of generations. Then to find themselves in context where so many odds seem to be stacked against them academically and economically, and too frequently also culturally, socially, and politically, and where therefore dreams and aspirations seem to evaporate within quarters and semesters, the choice is limited: struggle or resign. Mlungi Sicele showed in his remarkable study of student activism at the University of the Western Cape that student struggles take on different types of action. He distinguishes between individual, survivalist strategies and collective actions, between actions that conform to expected norms and others that he termed non-normative. In 2015-16, a nationwide wave of such collective, non-normative student action. More concretely, a massive wave of student protests washed across the South African higher education landscape, leaving it forever changed. The demands of the students, which can be summarized as free, decolonized, quality higher education, were widely acknowledged as timely and legitimate, even if the students' ways of raising them were not always endorsed. The 2015-16 student movement, known by campaign hashtags such as hashtag Rhodes Must Fall, hashtag Black Student Movement, hashtag Open Stellenbosch, hashtag Fees Must Fall, hashtag End Outsourcing, hashtag National Shutdown, hashtag RU Reference List, and so forth, has been studied, of course, from a variety of disciplinary perspectives since then, including historical, political, and educational viewpoints, and for different purposes. Books and journals have been filled with the writings of student activists, such as the one by Chikane, Olanga, Mnaweni, or the reflections of vice-chancellors like Janssen and Habib, and the research of higher education specialists and academics like Boysen and Nyamjo. These have been examined, and theses have been examined, and degrees confirmed, like to Ahmed, to Mangioli, to Naidu, to Nduli. Politics have been changed, and new discourses and higher education practices have emerged during and in the aftermath of Fees Must Fall, like decolonization. Whoever talked about decolonization before 2015 in the higher education sector? However, very little has been said about the biographical impact of activists' movements on the student activists' life. Few publications in South Africa have started to consider this, and the book commissioned by the Council on Higher Education called Reflections of South African Student Leaders is one of few exceptions. Some former Fees Must Fall activists continue to make the news, having become members of parliament, like Nompendulo Mkhatshwa or Vuyani Pambo, who were student leaders at the University of the Witwatersrand, and Naledi Chirawa of the University of Pretoria. Other student leaders, like Kanya Tekeshe of Cape Peninsula University of Technology, or Bonginkosi Kanile of the Durban University of Technology, served jail time for their actions during Fees Must Fall. The first wave of Rhodes Must Fall related and Fees Must Fall related protests in 2015 is frequently considered as peaceful. Certainly, there were many moments of frustration, aggression, and confrontation, but violence on the side of the state, the institutions, and students tended to be within very strict bounds. Unlike the campus cultures on many historically black and rural university campuses and universities of technology, where violent protesting has actually become, already by 2015, normalized. The protests at the University of Cape Town, at Free State and Wits, to mention but a few, and the banners like Rhodes must fall, Steyn must fall, fees must fall, during 2015 involved little to no violence. There were certainly isolated events where students and police or private security clashed, painfully so. However, the situation only turned rapidly in the final part and after October 2015. For instance, the fees will fall protests at UWC turned violent in late October and continued into November 2015. In February 2016, violence broke out at UCT, in part during the hashtag Shackville demonstrations, but also as part of other campaigns, and at UFS, a peaceful picket to end the exploitative practice of outsourcing the most vulnerable workers was assaulted into submission, first on the Shimla Park rugby field, and then for an entire week on campus with police invading student spaces, brutalizing and radicalizing the student movement there. From Rhodes University in the Eastern Cape and their campaign to end rape culture, to DUT in KwaZulu-Natal, student protests at institution after institution turned violent in 2016. And since 2015 and 16, Fees Must Fall has experienced several reruns. In each case, students have become witnesses, victims, or perpetrators of violence. Are we out of time? Can I continue? The research project that gave rise to this book was never interested in violence per se, or in establishing who fired the first rubber bullet or threw the first stone. We wanted to explore the ways the students understood violence, how they would recover from exposure to violence, how they would restore some semblance of well-being. On the one hand, the study of violence is often limited to the pathology associated with it, and little consideration is given to strength and resources drawn in the wake of experiences of violence. On the other hand, well-being research often also focuses specifically on the positives of life only, the I feel good part, to the neglect of what is actually the dance of positives and negatives that actually so often produces real flourishing in individuals. It was with this in mind that a photo voice study was designed, and it is against this that this exhibition outside and this book that we're talking about here aims to contribute conceptually, practically, and politically to positive change by presenting students' experiences of violence and aggression during the 2015-16 movement, as well as the resources they've drawn upon to restore their well-being and flourish amidst such experiences. Our concern as students and researchers of higher education is student well-being, especially the well-being and flourishing and success of those most vulnerable students in higher education, those who struggle to succeed in a context of the interlocking matrix of oppression that Collins describes, for example, that characterizes the intersection of so many markers of social identity at university: class, race, disability, gender, language and ethnicity, parental level of education, prior schooling, sexual orientation, and so forth. Well-being, as defined in positive psychology, is a precondition for learning. And the correlation between well-being and academic achievement is highly significant and very well established in literature. Especially in the aftermath of Fees Must Fall, universities have seen rising incidences of mental health problems and even suicides across campuses, across the country. Our concern was not to apportion blame or responsibility, but our concern has been and continues to be the transformation of the higher education system, and to ensure that institutions are non-violent, that the society is non-violent, We hope to contribute to university environments that are fit to develop critically constructive, active citizens, such as it is in the 97 white paper. Graduates that have the skills, knowledge, and attributes to make a successful transition into the world of work, to become well-rounded young people who find their place in our shared humanity and are stewards of this planet and the life it is a home of. We hope to advocate through the process of research, through knowledge and advocacy work, for a new kind of society, a new kind of politics and leadership. We hope to contribute to flourishing students and young people, a flourishing university, flourishing society, a flourishing Africa. Thank you.
So that was theory on behalf of Cleomore and the other authors. We are fortunate to have with us two discussants who have both read the book and have agreed to comment on the book. So to begin with, I want to invite Professor Lebo Moletsani, the J.L. Dube Chair in Rural Education at UKZN, a senior scholar and an accomplished author, to share her thoughts about the book.
Thank you. Hi, everybody. Dumelang sanibonani. Good evening, Huye and Abshen, I think. It is an honor for me to stand here today. The book actually excites me a lot. Because of, well, you'll hear just now. So for me, pictures or images speak. And often they speak the unspeakable. Through pictures or images, we are able to speak the unspeakable. Just as an example, those of you who are old enough will remember a picture that was published in the New York Times on the 26th March, 1993. The picture became known as the Vulture and the little girl who turned out to be actually a boy. So this picture by Kevin Carter photographed a little girl during a famine in the Sudan, and captured the child actually collapsing before she could or he could reach the United Nations feeding center. The picture would subsequently win a Pulitzer Prize. However, for Kevin Carter, it came as a prize because of the backlash he received and being accused of indulging in poverty porn. Kevin Carter would subsequently take his own life, apparently as a result of the backlash that he received. So pictures do speak, and pictures speak powerfully. In the context of this book today, in a period where students and student activists have been labeled as a bunch of violent and not really focused on their studies, a group of people. This book, in the aftermath of Fees Must Fall, is not only important, but it is timely. With the much talked about fallist campaigns before 2015 and more explicitly in 2015 and 2016, having reminded us researchers of the need for relevance in our programming, including research and teaching. The book contributes to deepening our understanding of who our students and student leaders are, and what has shaped and continues to shape their experiences of the university. As a visual essay in the culture of visual studies and visual sociology, in the aftermath of Fees Must Fall, manages to draw appropriately and creatively on the contemporary theoretical thinking and empirical work on violence and student well-being in higher education. It adds to a growing number of books and productions in South Africa. For example, the book and the project led by Charlene Swartz and Alude Mahali and other colleagues, published in the book Studying While Black, published by the HSRC Press also, and their documentary, Ready or Not, which chronicles the experiences of students across 8 institutions, similar to the institutions that you selected in the book today. So while I could say a lot about this book, good things and bad things, today I've chosen to focus on its methodology and the methodological rigor and contribution that I feel it makes. First, if we are serious about doing research and decolonizing research processes and generating knowledge from the perspectives of those who are experiencing the issues or the phenomenon under study, the authors of In the Aftermath of Fees Must Fall could not have chosen a better method than photo voice and other arts-based methods. Participatory research methodology in which photo voice is located engages participants, in this case, university students and student leaders, in the co-construction of knowledge, in the critical examination of the world around them, and action to address the social problems they identify. It challenges the notion that social science researchers can approach research such as this as neutral, objective, and value-free scholars. Instead, participatory research recognizes participants as researchers themselves and as knowers and actors in their own lives in pursuit of answers to the issues that they encounter. Its basic assumption, as we have heard, is that people who experience the problem, I think one young man earlier outside said this, the people who experience the issue are in the best position to talk about the issue and to document the issue. This is based on the understanding also that to improve the lives of people, to improve the lives of students in our institutions, we need to think about and list alternative research paradigms, drawing on the insights of the participants or of the students themselves. In this book in particular, as I went through it, I felt that as a visual method, photo voice enables the book to creatively blur the boundaries between the use of the visual text, which are the photographs, as modes of inquiry or modes of research, as modes of representation, representing the lives of the participants or of the students, and as modes of dissemination, as we see in the exhibition outside. This means that the visual then becomes both the methodology and the subject matter around which we can hold dialogues and so on. In a truly decolonizing and decolonized way, photo voice, as used in this book, also enables the blurring of boundaries in terms of what counts as data and what counts as academic knowledge. As Caroline Wang, who pioneered photo voice, concluded, the images in this book, for me, contribute to how the participants and other students see themselves, how they define and relate to the institutions, and what they see as important for us as institutions to change. There are also lessons, not only in the physical structure of the images, but more importantly in how the participants and us as the audience or the readers interpret the images in question. By using photo voice, and I saw a string of poetry in the book opened up for me democratic spaces for students to bear witness through the images and the exhibitions and the dialogues such as these linked to them, the right to tell their own stories without us as researchers telling their stories. For policymakers, I think I see a few of them in the room, and decision makers at the universities, it is difficult to ignore the issues when they are visually right in your face, as they are in the images. Without explicitly saying so, the book challenges us as higher education institutions to think seriously and creatively about violence, what to do with it, including the structural, the symbolic, and the physical violence that our students experience in and around our institutions, and the need for us to think seriously about how we ensure their well-being. There is a lot more I could say, but in the interest of time, I thought that to whet people's appetites and to encourage them to get a copy of the book, or at least to read the e-copy, I want to end my comments with a found poem. For those who are interested, a found poem is constructed from research data such as this, where you select keywords that speak to you about the gist of the work and the gist of the messages and themes that are communicated. So my found poem then goes, imagine you are listening in the voice of Don Matera or Lebu Mashile, or which I'm not, obviously, but just imagine that. Just close your eyes and imagine that. So my found poem from the book is The Battle of Liberty, or the epitome of violence. No retreat, no surrender. No VIP in the revolution. Causality of the revolution. A calm before the storm. A betrayal of hope. Spirit of unwanted peace, protest and violence, strategic. Conscientize and mobilize. Work for a just cause. Mobilize, educate, and strive. For our well-being, escape to safe spaces, spaces of strength, joyful rebellion, chillaxing. I think you had Lebu Mashile there. So to end, congratulations to the authors and their co-researcher participants for this welcome contribution and for raising, I think, the bar on methodological relevance and rigor in investigating students' experiences of violence and well-being in universities. Thank you very much.
Our next discussant is someone I call a next generation scholar. This is a scholar in the making. I think it's vitally important that we create platforms and we provide opportunities for the next generations and the new generations of scholars to share their thinking and practice their craft. So it gives me great pleasure to invite Ms. Innocentia Alexander, a PhD candidate in our School of Education, to address us.
Good evening, everyone. I'm really grateful for this platform, invited by Professor Bedat, to share my thoughts on the book. Congratulations to the authors, and for those who have not read the book, waiting in anticipation. It's an amazing book. So the goal of the book, as it was discussed earlier, was to expose the high levels of violence on universities' campuses and the impact that it has on student well-being, and also to advocate for a more responsive higher education policy and leadership. So the book highlights experiences of violence in the aftermath by taking a wellness approach through Vulture voice, as Prof. Moletane mentioned, the methodological stance it took, World Cafe through focus groups, and this proved to be a catalyst for healing, as it was discussed in or by the participants. The strength of the book is, or what I found was, a way in which the authors did not define violence in the onset in the book, but how violence was defined came from the participants. And it was understood through their photos and how the participants, the student activists, narrated their experiences in the context of student movements. So some of the ways in which violence was defined was violence is historical, and this speaks about the past and the marginalization and the oppression that took place from those who fought the struggles that we are currently fighting. And violence being spatial, looking at the oppressive spaces, and there is a theme that speaks about oppressive spaces where we know with the decolonization, the call to decolonize university spaces, this speaks to how the very structures still celebrate carnality and what do we see around us. We were just talking outside about decolonizing, I think, one of the rooms, and we made a joke about it. But the call to decolonize higher education is one I myself have, for my master's study, I looked at dismantling epistemic violence, and my focus was on academics' conceptual understanding of decolonizing the curriculum in higher education. And I so love how this book is now looking at students, which is the very focus point of the student movements. But the reason why I looked at, in my study, the academics, because the academics are the ones that deal with the day-to-day engagement with students, and to what extent are they moving with the call to decolonize the curriculum through their pedagogical practices. And another way in which violence was defined as violence is epistemological. So I've just spoken about how our knowledge has been marginalized, our experiences have been marginalized in the spaces where we celebrate Eurocentric thoughts, to the demise of our own knowledge, our cultural experiences, and even our day-to-day experiences. And violence is personal. And this one became very personal to me. And the book, I must say, it really allowed me to reflect back on the student movements of 2015 and 2016. I was exiting the university space, and I was not really involved in the student movements, and I mean not involved at the forefront of the student movement. And when I was reading this book, I had to think, how was violence imposed on me? And when I looked at my very stay in the university space, it was always one where there was fear, because I never knew when the next scholarship will come. I went through my 4 years studying at the university, always fearing that I'll be excluded. And at one point, I was excluded. And I remember, and how I'm defining my violence is very personal. It was very silent in that I did not have anyone to talk to. I did not have anyone to go home to cry and say, I'm being financially excluded, what to do. As many students who might be here, we are first generation to be in this space where we're seeking to economically emancipate ourselves, and our families are looking at us. And I must say, I really celebrate our student activists that were in the forefront fighting the struggle for fees must fall and roads must fall. So the book also speaks about well-being. How did students cope? It spoke about well-being where students found peace in spaces where they could hide, running away from police, running away from security. Well-being in togetherness, where students would come together, students who are fighting the same fight, through singing, through dancing, through debating, and well-being epistemological, where students found reading the work of Black intellectuals, where they could find strength, pride, and resilience. And there were also negative coping mechanisms that were mentioned in the book, where some students resorted to drug and alcohol abuse. As I noted before, that I cope just by being alone. And when we write about the pain and the pain that the students have gone through and how we want to foster this well-being, to what extent are we really rehabilitating our students? Are we speaking about well-being just as an abstract thought, or are the conversations, ongoing conversations that we're seeking to have, where we are looking at those students who were jailed? Where are they now? We are looking at those students who are traumatized by the violence that took place, during these student movements. Where are they? So the picture that's really stood out for me was the one where the Vice-Chancellor of Rhodes University came, and the picture depicts him kneeling down and meeting with students. And this is what was coming through in the book, that students did not want to resort to violence. What they wanted was for management to listen to their cries. And this picture had a caption that stated, "Power shared is not power lost." So the Vice-Chancellor coming and crouching and coming down to the level of the students, for me, spoke in volumes that, for one, he listened and he understood the power dynamic that was at play. So just to theorize the book a little bit, using Nancy Fraser's theory of social justice, because this is what we are seeking, social justice. And Nancy Fraser, in understanding social justice, speaks about 3 dimensions of social justice that need to be present to ensure that the social justice is present. The one being the economic, cultural, as well as the political. So with the economic, it is the unequal distribution of financial resources. So at the very heart of the student protests, the fees must fall. It's because students are fighting for this economic emancipation. We want to be able to access universities, but because we are not financially stable, for lack of a better word, we are excluded. So the economic dimension is very important for us to participate as equals in society. And then the cultural dimension she speaks about is about patterns of misrecognition. And this speaks a lot to the decolonization of the calls to decolonize the university spaces, where we as students felt that our languages, our ways of being, what we have to offer in terms of knowledge has been not recognized. So that was recognition. And then the political one was misrepresentation. She says that we need to have a political voice. Students having a political voice in the decisions that affect them. And that's important. So the 3 dimensions are very important in order to ensure social justice. Although there were some gains with the fees must fall, particularly with the household incomes, we know it moved from 120,000 household income to 350 household income, but we are still seeing an emergence of fees-related student protests with the recent Wits Asina Mali. So how do we mend the deteriorating university-student relationships? It is one that we're having tonight, open dialogue, and the colloquium that we're seeking to have tomorrow is very important. And in closing, management should also be accountable when things go wrong for the university and the good relations, and when good relations collapse. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Innocentia, and I think you'll agree with me that you shouldn't be surprised, and I won't be surprised if in about 4 years' time or 5 years' time we'll be launching another book here with the author Innocentia Alexander. Long way to go, but we'll get there. Okay, so tomorrow between 9 a.m. and 4 p.m., we have an exciting colloquium of about 30 people, including the authors of the book, scholars, student leaders on student politics and higher education transformation in the aftermath of Rhodes Must Fall and Fees Must Fall. Essentially, we are going to take a very critical look at where are we today in terms of transformation in and off universities. Where are we today in terms of student financing, decolonization of the curriculum, and all those things. And Innocentia will also speak at the colloquium tomorrow. So in a way of summing up, the value of having discussants is it triggers thoughts, right? And before I hand over to you, let me indicate a few thoughts that both Professor Moletsane and Ms. Alexander have triggered in me. So I want to start firstly by narrating that about 4 or 5 years ago, I was speaking to Professor Phumla Gobodo-Madikizela, who we know was on the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, has done work on Prime Evil, Eugene de Kock, and today runs a program at Stellenbosch, which is on trauma, memory, and reconciliation. And Phumla had interviewed students at the University of Cape Town around Fees Must Fall. And one of the students said to her something that's like, just bewildering. He says to her, as a young black student, every day that I climb those stairs of UCT, and we know which stairs those are, they are the stairs that come from the Cape Flats, right? Where you are not meant to be at UCT if you come from the Cape Flats. He says to her, every day I climb those stairs, a part of me dies. A part of me dies. And I only start to breathe again when I leave that UCT campus. All right? This book is about violence and well-being. Universities are meant to be these places which are ennobling adventures for us, where we flower, right? Where we grow. What kind of well-being is it when every day you have to die in order to get a university education? What kind of violence is that on a daily basis? That's not a physical violence. Maybe that's a more insidious violence, where you literally have to kill yourself in order to get an education, and then you only breathe when you leave. Right? So on the same theme of well-being and violence, I worked under a fantastic dean at the most fantastic university, in my view, in the late 80s and early 90s, the University of the Western Cape. I wouldn't be standing today if it was not for that university and the kind of climate it created for young black intellectuals. I've often said a historically white university would have destroyed me. So you had to be at UWC to experience this. So my dean was the person who coined the term epistemological access. And what he was saying to all of us at UWC was this physical access, but that's just not good enough if you want well-being. You have to have epistemological access, right? Now, what the Fees Must Fall and Rhodes Must Fall does, and like a good student who must go beyond the dean and the previous generation, as Innocentia must go beyond us, and you young people must go beyond us, I begin to say that as important as epistemological access is beyond physical access, the question today, and the question that Fees Must Fall and Rhodes Must Fall raises for me in terms of well-being and violence, is no longer epistemological access alone. Access to which epistemologies? And whose epistemologies? Which knowledges and whose knowledges? Because if you are not exposing us to alternative epistemologies as part of the epistemicide of colonialism, where local and indigenous knowledges were destroyed, cultures were destroyed, languages were destroyed, if you are not going to induct us into other epistemologies, then you're doing a violence. You're basically saying we are people without a history, without a culture. I mean, how can you have well-being at a university if every day the curriculum and the hidden curriculum tells you you have no history, you have no culture, and it force feeds you a Western Eurocentric epistemology? Violence, well-being, at the level of knowledge and the curriculum. Okay? So it's a beautiful juxtaposition in this book, the well-being and the violence. And these are the kinds of things that we are not speaking about enough. And so tomorrow, in this kind of critical, empathetic environment, that's the kind of things we want to speak about. Is there well-being today, 7 years after fees must fall and roads must fall? What progress have we made? Or have we gone backwards to some extent? Is there still anxiety amongst academics about decolonization and this resistance to decolonizing? And what does that resistance do to the well-being of students? And so on. Okay? So hopefully tomorrow we will talk about those kinds of issues openly. For now, the floor is open to you to ask any questions, comments. Please just introduce yourself and
Thank you. My name is Rosa Mangioli. I'm from the University of the Western Cape, as Prof proudly spoke about its rich history, and I'm at the Center for Humanities Research there. First, I think I have to also regurgitate the idea that we have to appreciate the effort and the courage it took for the authors to start this project, because I think all of us know, and for very clear and structural reasons in South Africa, why this is a thorny subject. You know, for there to be people who want to take on this project, as difficult as it might be, I think it's always important that we must say that scholarship can only be alive if people give us things to discuss. So I want to appreciate that. But I have two questions and a comment, but it'll be a very eclectic appreciation of what was said today. So please do, I apologize for that. 10 days ago, we celebrated the 10th year anniversary of Marikana, the brutal murder of the Marikana miners. And I was having a conversation with my father this morning, and what we spoke about was how history was giving us an opportunity through Marikana, an opportunity to perhaps, you know, equalize this particular society that we live in. And when we were celebrating, or not celebrating, but commemorating, because it was nothing to celebrate, Marikana, I realized that all it is really a 12th of August every year thing. And slowly but surely, fees must fall and roads must fall itself are falling into this bracket of something nostalgic that we look at and think about, and never really about how do we connect the live-wise. So my question to the authors, and I'm through you, I hope you can speak, tell us about the experiences of the participants through you in relation to, I'm sure everyone has this frustration that what is it about South African civil society that cannot be able to connect the live-wise? Because the issue about Marikana was that these miners were demanding 12.5. They were demanding in their setting to be paid a better living wage. But us as South Africa, the rest of South Africa, we could have supported that particular movement outside of us being mining workers. Now the students were of course supported by society in general, but there wasn't a concerted and organized effort through social movements that went beyond that to say, how can we use the historical opportunity that Fees Must Fall is giving South African society to be able to transform this particular society? And so I wonder through the participants, if you can reflect on these frustrations. What is our inability to move beyond issue-based movements, but rather a holistical development and transformation of South African society? And then secondly, I want to speak around the question of what Prof spoke about, I think, earlier around the spectacular claims. Because what came up after Fees Must Fall and Roads Must Fall, of course, was a very beautiful opportunity for us to have something on the table which was historically ignored. And this particular thing was around how do we envision a decolonized society? And recently there was a book released at the University of Johannesburg around From Ivory Tower to Ebony Towers that spoke about decolonizing the curriculum. And in this particular book, the argument is being made, or a number of authors are making this argument that in order for us to begin to decolonize the curriculum, we must be able to decolonize the society in which that curriculum exists. Now, we find ourselves wanting to transform a society or transform an education in an untransformed society, and therefore we go around this particular rat race. And my thing around, again, and I want to speak to perhaps the dishonesty at times of academics themselves around higher education, because I listen to a lot of students who are saying that they're being peddled this whole idea in their classes. They're told that decolonial this, decolonial that, decolonial that. Now the term is becoming nebulous. The term is vulnerable to conceptually dishonest academics who are using it to say that, no, I've contributed, I've catered for this part of the curriculum, or I've catered for this part of progress, quote unquote. What is important is for radical left thinkers to think about how do we develop this particular conceptual repository, which is decoloniality, because the other question is that it cannot be that decoloniality is closed off to mean one thing. So how do we continue to think about this as an opportunity as scholars to make a clear and definitive position on what is it that the South African decolonial iteration is? How does it want to contribute to the broader African and perhaps the world's iteration of decolonization? Outside of this acceptance that decolonization is just the mentioning of the word and no practical things that are happening in transforming the actual curriculums and the societies in which these curriculums exist. And then the final question is that I want to appreciate again this whole idea of methodology. And Prof. Moletsane, I think that was, it resonated with me a lot, how you brought the methodology to life. Again, this whole notion around students always being taught to think in canons or think in compartmentalized ways about how we can potentially view knowledge or investigate or inquire about anything. And I think the photo voice methodology opens up this idea that we can be creative. In fact, the university, as it were, as a historical idea, is a space for creativity. But we see how academics, in large part, and of course this is a structural problem, not individuals, but in large parts are stringing students to be one-dimensional. This particular research designs are stale and all of those things. So I want to say that methodologically this might interest us even more in explaining our own experience if we are allowed to be able to be creative in the space. Thank you very much.
So, as the speakers formulate a response, in a nutshell, the first question really is, was there sufficient support extended to the faultless by the rest of society? But I think you'll agree you have to also ask the question from the other side, did the faultless reach out sufficiently to the rest of society, to workers and others, right? And the second part, I think, is you're saying is, let's be honest about this. In a nutshell, is the decolonial discourse becoming the tramping ground of a whole new generation of careerists who don't even understand what they're talking about? And how do you avoid that? Because that discourse can become liberalized very quickly by disconnecting it from questions of power in the rest of society and so on, as if you can transform the university on its own in an untransformed society. So, challenging questions, but exciting questions.
Thank you very much, Linda Gusle, for your questions and the comments. Of course, we cannot transform universities without actually looking at ourselves as individuals who make up those universities and the type of knowledge that we generate, which should be based on our society's First of all, it's important to self-respect, self-introspect. Who are we within the spaces as individuals, and who are we as community members? We all agree that Prof said that the university is a space where people need to flourish. But what is it that prevents us, or the spaces, to actually allow us to flourish? It is because the spaces do not actually belong to us. We don't feel that there's belonging. I don't see myself in this space. How come don't I see myself as an individual in this space? It is because what the space represents, what the space speaks of, what the space is, and what the space actually shapes me to be is not me. So through dialogue, challenging ourselves, we can actually slowly but surely transform. The fact that we are seated here, and as you rightly said, that we cannot use decolonization as an airy, very nice word. We should actually do something, but it starts with an individual. We all need to work together. First of all, question ourselves, what is it that we mean by decolonization? Does it really matter? How does it matter? How does it help us to actually be ourselves? So we need to actually introspect, get together, but also we have to, being at university, we have also to accept that there would be disjunctures. We'll always not agree. However, when we disagree, we ought to acknowledge that those disagreements are valid. Thank you.
Thank you, Linda Guhle. A little bit of personal history. I spoke to Lindo about 4 years ago, and he confessed something to me, that he is actually the culprit behind Fees Will Fall at UWC. He and his friend in one evening decided that this Fees Must Fall thing, UWC must start to also engage in this. And they thought, yeah, if at UCT they use Twitter, we use Facebook. And so Fees Will Fall was born one night in his res room. And I'm not sure whether it was Liberty or which res it was, but the battle for liberty started actually in the bedroom of Lindo Guhle. Lindo, your questions are spot on, of course. I want to engage with the issue around civil society. I was last week, we invited at the HSRC to speak a gentleman called Adi Kumar, who happens to be the executive director of Ndifuna Ukwazi. Ndifuna Ukwazi is a civil society organization that's in the housing space, and is basically doing a lot of work around the constitutional right to housing, working with people who are in informal settlements and so on. And he made one devastating comment when this man, who is deeply, deeply involved with the housing crisis in South Africa, said that in the housing sector, South Africa has become a failed state. I flew yesterday from Cape Town to Durban, and on the airports, there's always a free Sunday Times. And so I grabbed one, and on the plane, I read it. And on the front page of the Sunday Times, there was about the buses being burnt. And in that article, it said, in the transport sector, South Africa has become a failed state. And I was thinking about the education sector. And I wouldn't say that about the higher education sector. But I'm not so sure about basic education, actually. All that I see and all that I know is that in the education sector, there are a lot of failing schools. I don't think we can already say that the basic education department is also responsible for a sector of the state that has become a failed state sector. So we are talking about civil society, but actually every university in this country at this point is a public institution, is a state creation, a state institution. And when we're thinking about transforming the higher education sector, isn't it the failure to transform the state fundamentally? You know, and sometimes when, in fact, we were talking earlier, Spelele and I, last night, and one of the things that came out of that conversation was the question, to what extent has the colonial state just been painted black, and to what extent have we actually got a different state today? And to what extent is that state better? Obviously, I arrived in South Africa in 1995. I have a very clear yardstick to see what has changed since then. I don't have apartheid nostalgia. I didn't grow up in this country. I am under no illusion. South Africa is a better place than what it was in 1995. But a lot of things need fixing as well, right? And civil society is precisely one part where I could see, arriving in Cape Town in 95 and engaging with such things like, for example, at the time, the Community Video Education Trust that was in Cape Town, Bush Radio, and so on. I lived in the house of Saki Ahmad, where basically in that lounge, the Treatment Action Campaign was founded 2 years later, and so on, and so on. But I think there's only so much in this country where the entire economy is about 50% of it is actually state-run, right? You cannot ignore the state. And so unless we get the state to work, and I am actually working in a state institution in the HSRC, and we are all trying, we are trying really, really hard to contribute positively here, right? Okay, you know, there's just so much that one can do if the state just doesn't do things. But who is the state, right? It's just like in the universities themselves. It is actually every single person who is pushing some kind of paper, pen, or what, right? And if I don't do my job doesn't get done, okay? And it's really, I mean, it goes down to that. I mean, what has happened? What has happened? Is it work ethic? What is it, you know? What happens when you are the vice chancellor or the DVC or the dean or the department head or a lecturer or a gardener, and you are faced with seeing what's happening on campus every day, and you just decide that it's time for supper and I'm going home? I mean, so those were the kinds of things, what I observed when I came to the University of the Free State. So I was at the University of the Free State during Fees Must Fall. What I observed there was, you know, a glamorous vice-chancellor, Professor Jonathan Jansen, of course, with his presence, with his intellectual stature, and so on. But also, he was right there at Shimla Park. He was right there. And he didn't go and shout and said, stop the fight. He just decided to be as puzzled as everything else and what's going on. A couple of black students and workers for a stop outsourcing campaign invading a rugby field during the break and starting to sing and chant. Why? Because he didn't have time for a meeting the whole day. So they knew he's going to be at the rugby. So now we're going to invade the rugby field so that he might listen to us, because this thing has been going on now for too long. Okay? What happens? The white supporters running down from the stands, coming and bashing the protesters. Okay? What goes on in someone's head when you are responsible for the situation and you are the vice chancellor and you are there on the stand? What goes on in your head when you see all of this and all that your security person does is calling on enforcing the interdict, and the police gives the very same students who have just been bashed on the rugby field for an entire night the run around with rubber bullets and stun grenades. I actually left at that night. I left the campus of the University of the Free State, as one does when one is a staff member, at 5:30, and I drove home, and all that I could see is that, oh, there's a couple of people going to the rugby fields. I wasn't interested. I didn't know what was going on, really. At 10 p.m., I got an SMS. Campus will be closed from 12 o'clock midnight. I was like, what? Never. I need my laptop. So jumped into the car, rushed down to campus, used all the white privilege and doctor and what I had with my car to make it still in at 10:30, okay? Obviously, the security worker, no entry at this point. I said 12 o'clock. Here's the SMS. It said 12 o'clock. I went in. I couldn't believe what I saw, the runaround that I saw. I picked up with my car 3 students, one who was asthmatic, a girl. She almost died in my car. We drove into the main building, that beautiful colonial building on the main campus, right? And we hid there. And eventually had to go back to try and retrieve some IDs and phones and so on that were strewn around, because when the students were running away from the police, they just had to run and things fell out and so on. What does one think the next day when you then allow for the police to order to allow the riot police to enter the private residence spaces of the students and do raids in the bedrooms of students to see whether you can smoke out with tear gas the ones who are supposedly the instigators of the protest on the rugby field? And that continues for the next 4 or 5 days. So I think it's something that was one of the reasons why I had to say, this needs to be exposed. Because it didn't really make it anyway. This needs to be exposed. We need to have a different way of relating to one another. Can this be the right way of relating to one another? Right? People in authority just... I mean, what does it mean to be in authority? Where is the sense of... So, for example, this manual that Kiamo spearheaded for student affairs counselors, it talks about restoring well-being after violence. And it has 2 sections. The first section talks about the prevention of violence, and the second section talks about the restoring of well-being. And there are a couple of key points, and the first one around the prevention of violence is a simple one. It says, replace impunity with accountability. Very light point. But if we don't get that minor thing right, everything is going to go belly-shaped. And there are about 4 or 5 more such key points in there. And they come out not from smart people like Kiamo sitting on her desk and thinking about it, but it came from the students talking about what is wrong? What is going wrong? So yeah, it's a rot, I think. It's a rot in the state. It's a rot in society, actually, in the institutions, and we really, really need to wake up here. For those of us who still care. For the others, Australia waits. Yeah, I think I'll leave it there.
I'm good.
Any other comments, questions, colleagues?
Yes. Ngicela ukubonga nje ithuba. I would like to take the opportunity that I'm offered or given. I'm not really good in speaking. My name is Persis Leshongwe, but I'll try to relate or try to contribute to the panel of discussions and try to have maybe a piece of my mind in these discussions, because I think it's very important to first acknowledge the contributions that some of the authors contributed in the book, and the reason behind. Maybe am I used for another study, or maybe for credit, as some of the panelists have just alluded, but I'm concerned here. It is a very, very, very critical concern to organizations such as the HSRC. When we have realities of a failed state, it can be differentiated in many forms, and we can come up with many answers to try and figure out, because we'll end up having a blaming game. Let us have such discussions, having maybe solutions now, because solutions that we can implement to rectify what has happened, because I'm seeing that we are speaking in dialogues. Maybe it's been happening for years that I've been sitting in dialogues, but I'm sitting at home with many unemployed graduates. To what level are we speaking of decolonization in institutions? Because can we decolonize maybe the ontology behind the epistemologies that we are having here? Because we are having people who are studying sociology. I was fortunate enough, maybe 2 minutes ago, I was questioning one of the students, why are you here? She's saying, for the lack of a better word, I think it's one of the things that we think after the degree, let's go and start, or we are going to have jobs. The reality is that many of us here are not going to be able to enter the economic market. So that's why I was asking, to what level are we speaking of decolonization? The realities behind us sitting here. Maybe some of us are fortunate enough to access such dialogues, but the reality is that if I had such dialogues, maybe in a more radical or response way, maybe I'm targeting Melville Hall, where we have such discussions, because we also want to contribute, but we cannot access you guys. Who's funding such research? It's one of the questions, and why? Because we'll find ourselves having a sponsor, the same sponsor, funding such research without, maybe it's one of those things that happen, we have to have it historically there. But how do we then transform these lives that have already been affected? This is the key question that we must come at. I can volunteer now. I came here to volunteer, to transform people, maybe organizations in communities, underdeveloped communities. Transform those individuals who still have hope to come here and access these institutions. Some of us are in debt already. We cannot continue. This is our realities that are speaking now. To what level can we have on realities of a failed state? To what level are we having divisions in our own society? Because some of us cannot access Pavilion. We have to go maybe to Plaza Mall. Those are the realities that we're speaking about. Maybe the reality is that I cannot have coffee and a glass of beer in the morning after I'm going to work. That's the reality. But my boss is going to have a glass of beer and come for a few hours or few minutes. After that, at 12 o'clock, they're in Pavilion Mall having lunchtime and another beer. This is a typical example of to what level are we having a failed state and who is failing who, how. Because we cannot have a blaming game. But I think moving forward, I would like us to have access to you guys, come up with a radical solutions so that we are able to rectify what has happened, have those individuals and victims, maybe in a database system. That's one of the ways. How do we then transform them? Because some of us have criminal records. The same HSRC, I cannot be employed there because I have a criminal record. I was fighting. You see, this is a reality. How does the organizations themselves accommodate what has already happened so that we can have a transformed society and rectify these things? These are the realities we are facing, and I think I'm more interested in that and how are we moving forward, because we are in 5 years' time, maybe it's a vision I'm having, that we are going to have more higher fees, and maybe such skin or such conversation, such as people like us who cannot even access the job markets as we are speaking, are not going to be able to access such conversation. So I plead to the panelists. My name is Pesitla Shongwe. For contact details, everything, I plead that we move forward. Thank you.
Okay. Okay, thanks for that. A whole lot of questions there, which I'm not sure we're going to be able to get through tonight. I've just been told 7:30, people have to go off. People are providing services here and so on. So as much as we would love to take more questions and comments, unfortunately we have to bring this to an end. But let me just round up. I mean, you're raising important issues about research. And what kind of research does a body like the HSRC do, right? You're raising important questions, and you're reminding us it's not just about epistemology, it's also about ontology. So, to put it in a nutshell, it's not just about which knowledges, but what's our conception of who sits in front of us in a classroom? Because if we see them all as terrorists, then we're not going to be able to educate. If we have a different conception of them ontologically, maybe some real education will happen, right? And perhaps all those who are very nervous about decolonization have a particular picture of students, and that picture needs to change sometimes before we can have real education happening, right? People are too nervous and anxious about too many things, right? So some of these things hopefully will come up at the colloquium tomorrow, but I'm not sure we're going to be able to solve all these issues, because these are big issues. Sometimes we have to learn how to manage these issues to the best of our ability, because the solution are complex and requires changes not just within universities, but outside universities in the macroeconomic and policy environment. Thank you very much for attending. There's some snacks outside, and I invite you to take part in them and talk to the authors and so on. Thank you very much.
And the same would apply with the senior certificates in terms of the level 4 orientation as well as the level 4 English. In terms of our